welcome everyone. So thank you so much for joining us for the Ohio Peace and Conflict Study Network and the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict's first Peace Education webinar in the Higher Education series. And we want to especially thank Dr. Léna Crain, who is with Denison University, who will be sharing her good practice work there with us here in a moment. Before we get to our presenter, we'd like to share with you a little bit about GPPAC and the Ohio Peace and Conflict Studies Network. So GPPAC is actually a network of hundreds of civil society organizations around the globe working in the field of peace building. And that's everything from early warning, timely response, to mediation and dialogue, to help to prevent violent conflict. In addition, there's a peace education working group which represents all the world's regions with leaders from government and civil society who are helping to build capacity in their countries, both in higher education, primary and secondary level. And what we will be doing today is actually funded in part from GPPAC, from the Peace Education Working Group, from the Ohio Peace and Conflict Studies Network, which was developed as a result of those funds. So that is a consortium of about 24 Ohio colleges and universities in the United States that have either certificates, degrees, concentrations, or centers working in the field of peace building and conflict resolution, which includes human rights. Our first webinar series will be on conflict resolution models for student conduct, cultivating belonging. And one of the things that the Ohio Peace and Conflict Studies Network would like to help colleges and universities, not only in Ohio and the United States, but around the world do, is how do we integrate these core concepts into the work we do with students through student conduct and also in the community. So Dr. Léna Crain will share with us the student conduct work that they've been doing at Denison University. And student conduct work has historically approached individual and organizational conflict through administrative intervention, a transactional approach with limited opportunities for dialogue, healing, and community input. As alternatives emerge to address conflict while promoting peace and increased attention, Denison has built an innovative and inclusive model that provides students with a range of informal and formal means of resolving conflict. In the conflict resolution model, the emphasis is placed on restorative practices, including mediation, restorative justice, and direct referrals. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Léna Crain, who is the Associate Dean of Students at Denison University, where she built Denison's nationally recognized collegiate conflict resolution program centered on community building and dialogue through difference. Dr. Crain is a frequent trainer and speaker on conflict resolution, skill building, and restorative justice, and recently served as a faculty fellow for the ASCA Gehring Academy's Advanced Restorative Justice track. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you for the opportunity to share this work. When we are live on the screen sharing, Christina, would you give me a nod?
You are on, Dr. Crain.
Wonderful,
Yes.
thank you.
You can share also now your presentation as well.
Perfect, here we are. So I'm thrilled to share this work because I think it's a bit unique in the context of our larger network, and that's because the perspective that I bring is from the co-curricular perspective. And when we think about preparing students for future careers in promoting peace, this is a way to practice that very work throughout their co-curricular experience. And so I'd like to share a bit about our journey and how we believe that we're cultivating belonging and inclusivity through our approach to conflict resolution. I am situated on the campus of Denison University, which is in Granville, Ohio, the central Ohio area, and it's a small private liberal arts campus of about 2,300 students. And you see here on the screen some snapshots of the community and of Denison's campus.
Léna,
Yes.
sorry, we cannot see your presentation, so you just need to click on share.
Okay.
And then your PowerPoint presentation will be on the screen.
Okay, is that okay now? You can see it?
Yes, perfect. Thank
Great.
you very much.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So there was the first one. And we're situated in Granville, Ohio on Denison University's campus. The learning objectives that we have today are to understand the historical foundation and merits and opportunities of what we would consider a legacy of student conduct programs. What we practice now is a conflict resolution program, and we'll explain the distinction there. We'll spend some time on restorative justice, or RJ for short in particular, and the philosophy and practices, including what exists on campuses, including Denison's. We'll talk about how community members can advocate for the implementation of restorative justice, and we'll highlight examples for successful implications of town gown incidents, for example. So when we ask the question, as I often do, what comes to mind when one thinks of conflict? The responses are varied, and granted, folks who are accessing this webinar are probably from peace and conflict scholarship, and so we realize the inherent potential of conflict and conflict studies. But by and large, when we ask folks to think about what comes to mind with conflict, there's an adverse reaction. We're a conflict-averse society, and so things come up that are largely negative. In the context of conflict on a college campus, people think about vandalism or the incidents related to drug or alcohol abuse, the things that might violate the climate or bias incident. And so when we think about conflict and the situation of a college community, what comes to mind is immediately negative. And that, of course, is at odds with what comes to mind when we think of or define belonging, which is the opposite. It's a feeling of affinity or inclusion or membership, a feeling of community, in short. And so I think there's a misconception by and large out there that when we think of conflict, that it is incompatible or incongruent with the notion of community. But I don't think that that's true. I think it has everything to do with the way we respond to conflict, and that gives us a direction to our community about whether we belong and who belongs. To help understand this, I think it's important to consider the historical foundations of what we've come to know as student conduct, and before that, student judicial services or student discipline. And in short, those things were derived from their equivalent criminal justice practices. I'm operating in the context of the United States, where the criminal system is one of law and order, of transaction and punishment. And this graphic here represents the people who were the holders of power and the key decision makers when it came to law and order and so-called justice. You'll see that it is largely white men, and I think that came to represent the holders of power and the upholders of justice, so to speak. And so in short, we found that student conduct programs over the years were built to reproduce the elements of the criminal justice system that we saw depicted there on the other screen. And what we know about that criminal justice system is that it disproportionately harms underserved communities. We're talking about women and communities of color, both by way of differential outcomes and also the way it promotes or stifles voice through student conduct processes. And so if we had to summarize in short the three steps or stages of student conduct programs, we could boil it down to say that there is, first and foremost, after a violation, there is transaction, there is a punishment, often completed remote to the source of harm. And as a result, we see a disconnect in community, a disconnect between the wrongdoer and the folks who have been harmed, a disconnect between folks who are quick to say, you haven't done enough, or you haven't done anything at all when it comes to resolving conflict or transforming conflict. And so while we can see the way that student conduct programs have evolved, there are a lot of reasons why student conduct does not work as well. And that's because harmed and responding folks, in this case students, have less agency and voice throughout the process because it's an administrative resolution. It depicts the administrators, faculty, and staff that are fulfilling a process. It depicts those folks rather than the community as a keeper of values and justice and connection. We find in these models that outcomes are much less connected to the source of harm. I mentioned that outcomes are often completed remotely and not in conjunction with the harmed community. And then as a result, we find that community is disconnected from opportunities for repair, and as a result, they misunderstand the intention. And so in doing so, we inadvertently erode a sense of belonging for those who harm, and also those who hurt. And so we see an opportunity here to perform conflict resolution and transformation to fulfill the objectives that student conduct cannot. And so at Denison, we practice a conflict resolution approach. And the parallel to those 3 steps of student conduct programs is that rather than a transaction, there is dialogue. When we look at conflict resolution approaches, there is a dialogic and transformational approach that is much less transactional. Rather than remote education, there's an emphasis on repair as close to the sources of harm as possible. And what we see as a result is there is a resolution and connection to community that cannot be fulfilled in the same ways through a student conduct approach. The power of conflict resolution is that harmed and responding folks are able to participate with more agency and check in on their values throughout a process because it's participatory in nature. Participants, whether they are harmed or responding folks, they practice mutual empathy and vulnerability. And we know from the literature that that is how we transform conflict. That's how we promote peace by practicing that empathy and vulnerability as a means of learning and mutual growth. We find because of these things that we're able to restore, repair community at the sources of harm, which is important to do if we're going to address that community disconnect that we understand to take place in some student conduct programs. And the process as a result, conflict resolution processes are accessible, that is, by students across different identities and participation membership groups. They are transparent processes because they are so participatory. They share power and they are also accountable. I think a critique that sometimes comes up and is unfounded is that the peace processes, conflict resolution processes, lose their accountability. And we've shown here that that's not true at all. And so here at Denison, we practice, I mentioned, a spectrum model of conflict resolution. There are several powerful examples on college and university campuses in the US, but here's Denison's in short. You'll see that there are a range of practices ranging from quite informal to rather formal. And so if you're more familiar with traditional transactional models of student conduct, you'll find those situated on the right-hand side of your screen in what we might call administrative resolution or a conduct board meeting type setting. But there are a lot of things before that are much less formal and more focused on the human element, growth, repair, addressing things at their source. We'll focus on 2 here today, which are those in the center of the spectrum, which is to say they carefully balance a level of informality and education with a desire to transform conflict through humanness. And one of those is mediation. It's a simple practice if you're familiar with mediation. In short, individuals meet with a third party, a multi-partial or omni-partial mediator who discuss expectations and help the folks gathered to reach a mutual compromise. And we find on our campus that first-year students and also senior students use this practice the most. And then in restorative justice, Denison is a leader in the use of RJ within the context of what one might call student conduct, but really across our campus. And what we find here is that individuals and harm parties are meeting with a third-party facilitator to acknowledge harm and mutually construct an outcome. That is, how are we going to repair harm and heal and restore community where possible and move forward together. And this practice is community-driven, participatory, it's socially just when we look at the roots of restorative justice, and we find that it's transformational. The outcomes that result from matters addressed with restorative justice are truly powerful. Restorative justice is the repair of harm and restoration of community and relationships through related practices. And so those practices are repairing harm by bringing those who commit wrongdoing together with those who are most affected. We work from the center of harm, and so upon identifying an incident, we find who was most directly, most immediately harmed, and we work out from there. There is scholarship that suggests a peak number of participants. You know, there's something to be said about keeping it intimate, keeping it such that participants can speak from their individual experience with the harm and work together to create a space that is vulnerable without being punitive or targeted towards the folks who are doing the wrongdoing and practicing the courage to come forward and sit with the folks who they have harmed. And so a facilitator guides a conversation, a series of questions, the goal of which is to acknowledge the harm, but most importantly, work toward a mutually constructed means of repair and moving forward together. When we look at different means of addressing conflict, this is a popular concept where we are looking at ways that we balance control and support. Of course, the absence of control and support would be neglect of a conflict, and then there are approaches that are quite punitive. We could say some student conduct programs would fall into that high control but low support category. And then there are some approaches that are emphasize encouragement, but not so much on the accountability or the control of it. But restorative justice is ideal because it is a transformation of conflict together, with. And so we're not doing something for someone, we're doing it alongside them. And that's where conflict transformation really lives. Historically, where restorative justice came from was simultaneously all over the world, but in Indigenous communities. And so we see here 3 examples in 3 very different regions of the world. In North America, for example, it's well documented in Indigenous communities, in Indigenous justice systems, that what we now call restorative justice has long been practiced. In the Navajo community, for example, there was a practice that when someone committed harm, they were physically sent away from their community into the wilderness to think about the harm that they had caused, to contemplate means of repairing or addressing that harm. And then after a several days journey, they were welcomed back into their community, by way of their physical presence, where they circled with members of their community and talked co-constructively on how to address that harm. And that is very similar to what we might practice today in restorative justice circles. Similarly, in the South Pacific, Aboriginal justice models in Australia, for example, also practice this idea of bringing together harmed parties and wrongdoers to co-create a means of repair and moving forward together. And then on a large scale, for folks who say that, this is all well and good for one-to-one harm, but what about larger scales? Rwanda, post-genocide Rwanda, practiced restorative justice on a massive national scale. And when you talk about hundreds of thousands of harmed parties and also many, many folks who inflicted harm, there has been a practice of restorative justice on a massive national scale through the National Unity and Reconciliation Program in Rwanda. And so that's the foundation of restorative justice. One common misunderstanding is that that RJ is an easy way out. For folks who would say that models that address conflict for a party are more powerful because of that emphasis on control, they might say that RJ is absent of accountability. And so the question posed here is RJ an easy way out? And I would say absolutely not. Think about what the hardest things you have ever had to do might be. Is it to perform community service or write a paper or be on probation? I mentioned those things because those are some common outcomes in traditional student conduct type programs. But I would argue that what is more difficult for us as humans is to forgive, to sit with discomfort, to show grace or flexibility, to look in the eye and move forward together, to co-create with people who have harmed you or who you have harmed. Those are the difficult things in our humanness, and those are the things that restorative justice emphasizes. And so to those who would say that RJ is absent of accountability or the easy way out, I would say that there's an emotional labor that allows the transformational power of RJ to be so deep. RJ emphasizes accountability, deep listening, dialogue through difference. That's distinctive from dialogue across difference, because you are navigating discomfort to understand rather than speak across a divide. RJ emphasizes grace and forgiveness, healing, belonging, and community. And so we're connecting that service via a circle. I'm often asked, can RJ be used for any situation? Can we accept any conflict on its face, or is there deeper consideration and prerequisites, if you will? And at Denison, I think my colleagues in RJ and other settings would agree, but there are some prerequisites to participation in restorative justice. For example, first and foremost, the parties have to recognize that there has been some harm. And I think we occasionally encounter conflict where that learning has not yet happened, where folks are hesitant or unable to recognize that there's been harm. But that's a prerequisite, of course, to gathering and navigating harm and addressing its repair. The second is that folks have to be committed to repair. This, for the part of the folks who are harmed, means that they have to be willing to show some grace, perhaps some forgiveness, and work with others to repair. And of course, on the part of the person who has inflicted the harm, they also have to be committed to repairing that where possible. And then a willingness to participate. There are a number of situations for which I would not recommend restorative justice. There may be situations that face-to-face interaction with others might be triggering or re-traumatizing, and we certainly want to avoid that. It's somewhat debated and becoming increasingly embraced in the RJ community, the practice of restorative justice for sexual disrespect, be it sexual violence, sexual harassment. And so there's an increasing practice and some related literature related to that. So worth considering here. So recognition of harm, commitment of repair, and willingness to participate are three prerequisites to restorative justice. And again, this is how we situate it within Denison's conflict resolution model. There are some parts that are quite structured, but by and large, it is a human process that is somewhere between informal and formal, and it's a way to emphasize our humanness to transform conflict. The language that's here on the screen, community building, mentoring, agency, human dignity, compassion, global citizenship, moral discernment, dialogue, engagement, this is a verbiage that is pulled from the mission and vision statements of a number of liberal arts colleges, including Denison. And I highlight this because what we say we value as institutions and as educators, and these are things that are also uplifted through the practice of conflict resolution programs, through the practice of things like restorative justice. And so when it comes to modeling our values, especially in the co-curricular atmosphere, and promoting through practice, just things that we hope students will practice in their postgraduate lives. This is a form of peace pedagogy, and if we would like students to practice this after graduation, this is an excellent supplement to what they may or may not be getting in their curricular experience as well. In short, we can invite people, whether they're students or other members of the community, to be included and represented in the way that we talk about, address, and transform conflict. To shift a bit about how we know it's working, I think across the higher ed and student services area, it's important to demonstrate evidence of how we know that education is happening. And so we, of course, are collecting some data related to our practices, including restorative justice. There are some metrics that we look at across our practices, for example, recidivism, that is, are folks subsequently violating policy or the same policy, and then some experiential things as well. But here's a data snapshot to emphasize how we know this is working. To use restorative justice as an example, 100% of our participants, and so this is across 2.5 years, many circles, 100% of participants, whether they were harmed parties or folks who had inflicted harm, they reported having a better understanding of others' experiences and feelings. And so we believe pretty confidently here that the practice of restorative justice is helping folks to feel heard and to understand others by way of their participation. Powerfully, 100% of participants said that their conflict was resolved fairly. And so again, to connect to that misconception, perhaps that there is no accountability or that there are not powerful outcomes that resolve, 100% of our participants said that their conflict was resolved fairly. And then interestingly, 0% of participating responding students, that is folks who inflicted harm, none of them have subsequently violated policy. And so this says that dialogue, to sit with folks who you have harmed, to co-construct an outcome, and to learn and grow and be forgiven is a powerful way to transform conflict and also to reduce recidivism. Here's some narrative information from one case that was addressed with restorative justice. I'll paraphrase here, but the student who was involved said prior to the restorative justice meeting that they didn't feel like their full story was going to even be worth explaining because people wouldn't take the time to understand where they were coming from. But they were surprised to learn that in the room people actually cared and they asked questions that treated them like a human, and they didn't talk much about what preempted the RJ circle, that is a theft in this case, at all. And so they were surprised by that, but they also realized that they had hurt people through their actions. And so there was this learning about how their actions affected others. And there was that learning that happened by being the recipient of grace. And from another perspective, this one from a harmed party in this RJ circle, they entered the conversation writing off the student. They believed them to be careless, selfish, and criminal, their words. Hearing their story changed my life. I left wanting to forget what brought us there, that is the theft, and to help the student succeed. So look at these perspectives. We have the perceptions of the harmed and the wrongdoer who entered a circle having some preconceived notions that were transformed. The way we entered talking about this conflict was transformed, and certainly our connection to and understanding of one another was similarly transformed through restorative justice. And so in considering our responses in a co-curricular sense to conflict on college campuses, what some folks might call student conduct, I challenge my colleagues to think about whether our response invites students who have violated community, in the sense of violating community standards, university policies kind of thing. Does our response to conflict invite our students to belong to our community, or do we deepen an outcast by way of that violation? So does our response to conflict invite students who violate community to belong to our community? This time I'd be happy to take your questions. My email address is here on the screen. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crain. And so if you don't mind leaving that slide up for a moment there. So we have a number of people on. Because this is the first in the series for the Ohio Peace and Conflict Studies Network webinars, let me just share briefly how we normally do questions. So for those of you who've joined us, if you have used Zoom before, or if you haven't, if you scroll your mouse down towards the bottom of your screen, you're going to see something where it says chat. And if you click on that, you'll be able to send to, you'll put in the 2 there. You can click the down box and click on everyone. And we'd ask that you post your questions there. That way we can take a number of the questions. Some of them might be similar, and we'll take questions that way. And Dr. Crain can answer those in the order in which she chooses. So if folks would like to go ahead and use the chat box, and that also helps us keep a good record of what is of interest to folks. And Dr. Crain, so what would you recommend for someone starting out with a restorative justice process in their college or university? So they're really interested. We know we have a number of colleges and universities here in Ohio that would love to do this. So what do you recommend?
That's a great question. I think there are a number of ways that you can approach it depending on your institutional structure and decision-making ability. I think that's important because in some public institution settings, you may have to codify restorative justice practices, and that could involve a full review by shared governance, by kind of at the state level. And so if you're in that sort of environment, I would recommend starting small and start with restorative practices. Restorative practices are practices or outcomes that address harm at its source without involving, for example, a full process or circle potentially. You can be restorative in the language that you use. For example, at Denison, we say reporting student and responding student instead of, the plaintiff defendant kind of criminal language. We say meeting or conference instead of a hearing. We say alleged violation of policy instead of charges. And so you can adopt a restorative human language and move away from that criminal language even subtly. You can start to build capacity. There are a number of free, easy to access resources online. David Karp he is kind of one of the leaders in restorative justice on college and university campuses, and he and his colleagues will offer a number of things complementarily online. You can engage in reading all the way up through training to become a restorative justice facilitator. And from there, I would explore interest on a campus, even among students, so that you can build that interest and then seek to formalize it in a way that best fits your campus environment.
Great, thank you. I noticed that a couple of folks who joined us actually just joined us by phone, so we won't have them right in the chat there, but would anyone else like to go ahead and ask a question? So if you are muted, you would unmute yourself, and if you're having any trouble, either put your question in the chat to me and I can try and help you with the technology as well. Alex, Luis, or Virginia?
Hi, this is Alex. Can you hear me?
Hi, Alex. Yes.
Great. I'm from Bluffton University. We have a restorative justice process in place in our student conduct system. It is somewhat successful. And we've had lots of conversations about revising it over the years. But I was really interested in the last point that you made about outcomes that invite students into community rather than perpetuating sort of students feeling like they are more disengaged from the community of the university after their conduct process has happened. I'm wondering if you could give any examples of what some of those outcomes that invite students into community might be.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a great question. I think there were a couple of questions in there actually, but okay. So to talk about outcomes, you can have a restorative outcome or practice without a full restorative justice circle or process. And so some restorative outcomes that are basic and already practiced. For example, an apology, provided it's heartfelt, an apology that is that is desired rather than prescribed. But an apology is something that restores harm at its source. And so on its face, it might seem simple, but it's indeed restorative. Community service is a way to put proportionate good back into a community. And I think sometimes there's the risk of further harm if the receiving folks are not open to having that service in the community of harm. But community service in general, we know that it's a way to dismantle privilege and put proportionate good into the world. And so community service can be an outcome. To give you something a little bit unique and very situation specific, we had a student who, while under the influence, they had ripped down a number of door tags. This was in a residence hall, a number of door tags and posters and kind of messed up the community. And the folks who were most immediately harmed were some of the other residents in the hall and also the RA, the student leader of that area. And so we did a restorative practice in which the student went on call with the RA to understand the role and the responsibility and build a rapport there. They also hung up posters and recreated door tags, and then they understood the labor, and they were also undoing the harm or addressing the harm by putting proportionate good back in. So that's one example of a restorative practice. The thing about restorative practices is that wherever possible, we want the participation and consent of the folks who are harmed, because they are in the best position to know how to transform a conflict, how to address the harm. And that was the case in the example here that I gave.
Thanks so much. Alex, did that any further follow-up there before we move to Virginia's question?
No, that was great. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Alex, for being on. And so the next question that we have is actually from Virginia Litchfield, and she asks, could you please, Dr. Crain, give us the name of that online resource that you referenced that was free information? You gave his name, and that would be helpful to have that repeated. Thanks.
Yes, the name that I gave is David Karp. His last name is K-A-R-P, David Karp. I believe he is now at the University of San Diego. But if you Google David Karp and restorative justice or conflict transformation, you'll find a wealth of resources there.
Great, thank you. We did have one person join us also by phone, so I'm not sure if that person has a question, but if you want to unmute your phone there, we'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. Or Louise Matthews, who's also joined us from Bluffton College. While we wait for our next question, I did want to share that this is the first in a series, and we want to thank Dr. Crain from Denison University for being willing to be the first person to do this. But we do have a series coming up with Ohio colleges and universities and sharing each of their specialties in peace and conflict resolution, whether that be developing a certificate program, study away, or other kinds of peace and conflict resolution processes and courses. So the next one will be Study Abroad as Peace Pedagogy, which will be conducted by Kent State University on December 10th from 12 until 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. All of these, if you missed some or part of this webinar, will be archived both on the Ohio Peace and Conflict Studies Network webpage, as well as our sponsors, the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, which is based out of the Netherlands and who helped provide the funding for the startup for the Ohio Peace and Conflict Studies Network. So Dr. Crain of Virginia says, thank you very much for the information about David Karp, the University of San Diego. And do we have any other questions for Dr. Crain before we close here?
This is Louise Matthews from Bluffton University.
Thanks.
I have a fairly strong understanding of restorative justice and appreciate that not just on a college campus, but overall, like as a parent, as a community member, as an educator. I wonder if you and I'm not the one who implements this restorative justice at Bluffton. I wonder if you have any encouragement for those of us who could be a voice or help encourage those who are the ones who are doing this process or working with the students who have harmed community.
That's a great question. What I would recommend, one of the more powerful things that you can do is identify questions and misconceptions, and as an extension of that, barriers to why restorative justice might not be either widely understood or widely practiced. To give examples from my experience at Denison, I found early on that there was a pattern of the same sorts of questions, and with that, some misconceptions. Some of those were included in the presentation today, but the idea that restorative justice is an easy way out or that there's no accountability. And to that, I pose what I did today, which is that some of the more difficult human practices, forgiveness and grace and sitting through discomfort are required through RJ. Some of it is how do you explore fit for restorative justice, the prereqs that I mentioned. How do you incentivize participation? In Denison's case, restorative justice is an informal practice, which means that if students participate, usually the incident is not formally recorded on their disciplinary history, and I think that has made a difference for the type of situations that we've been able to address restoratively. And all this to say, I think if you consider what in your community, whether with faculty and staff or students or others, what for them are the misconceptions or fears or barriers, that can really help you to promote RJ or other conflict resolution practices as more viable in your community.
Thank you, that's helpful. I also recognize that when we have people in positions who have not been specifically trained or have not come into this position with that background already, it feels like a really big learning curve to add one more dimension of this working with students and their behavior, that it feels above, it feels extra, like this is the norm, this is the default mode, and anything else takes intentional working through. And yes, it seems difficult, and also then feeling like we're not hearing much about the process, the accountability. There's a lot of questions. If it's being used, we're not being included, informed about how well this is working or how challenging it is. So yes, I appreciate your responses.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for Dr. Crain before we close?
Thank you all for joining us and for your thoughtful questions. I'm happy to connect further by email, by phone. I truly, if you'd like to connect, I'd be happy to.
Great, thank you so much. And are there, aside from the individual that you mentioned earlier that was really a specialist in this area, David Karp, are there other places that you would suggest that colleges and universities who want to explore doing this at their own university should take a look, or any particular either online or hard copy resources?
Yes, there's if you're familiar with the Little Book series, there's the Little Book of Restorative Justice for colleges and universities. Actually, David Karp might be the author of that resource, but it's a book that I recommend whether you are more seasoned in the practice and looking to implement on a college campus, or looking to explore a restorative justice for the first time. So a good thing to slip to your colleagues if you'd like to expand the philosophy. The other, and this is an in-person resource, the ASCA, an association of student conduct educators, they put on an intensive summer workshop called the Gehring Academy. It is the premier experience for all types of conflict resolution, including what we think of as more traditional student conduct practices. But they do at the Gehring Academy a restorative justice facilitator training, and they will do restorative justice base track, sometimes advanced restorative justice. That was this past summer, and I think it is the most thoughtfully designed, inclusive, immersive, beautiful training. And so I'm a huge proponent of that experience, the Gehring Academy. Thank you, Jen, for putting that in the notes there.
You're welcome. Thanks. Great. Thank you so much. Any other questions before we close? Or comments? All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Crain. And again, everyone, if you missed some or part of this webinar, we will have them archived on the Ohio Peace and Conflict Studies Network webpage, as well as the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict. Our next webinar will be on December 10th at noon Eastern Standard Time on Study Abroad as Peace Pedagogy. So thank you again, Dr. Crain, and for all of you who joined us. And hopefully we'll see you and talk to you in December. Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.